So hello, this is Sam Musoke, the singing accountant. I have an accountant's life hack for you. And you'll like this if you work in finance, if you work for an NGO and you prepare donor reports, and if you're using a package like QuickBooks or something similar that can't track donor codes. So let's imagine you have a donor budget, something like this. This is from a USAID example. It could look anything different, but you've just got some different budget lines. So we've got some staff, individually named staff, some pension, some travel costs, some supplies with a different row for each type of supply, and we've got some activity costs. Now, if you've done your activity-based budgeting properly, each of your activities will have lots of sub-lines, but hopefully you only have to report by the heading line. So this report is by the heading line only. Now, this is your donor report, your donor budget lines, but let's imagine that your own organisation's chart of accounts looks entirely different, has different codes by expenditure type rather than by activity. This is an example of a chart of accounts. So how do you turn all these transactions in QuickBooks, which are organised by chart of accounts, into your donor report? Well, first thing, we're going to do a transaction listing export, but we're going to filter it so it's just for the donor that we want. Here's an example. Let me uncolour this for the minute. We'll come back to that. So here I tend to remove the spaces that go between each column as a default because you get a clearer report. You'll notice in the class that they're all donor 1 because I filtered it just for donor 1. And the first important thing you'll notice at the beginning of the memo, I have put the donor code for each transaction. I've actually reserved the first 6 spaces for the donor code. You'll see here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then the memo. Down here, same thing. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then the narrative part of the memo. So this means that whoever's entering your data needs to be trained in and get used to reserving the first 6 or however many you need characters of the memo purely for that reference number. Incidentally, I've got the account in here as well, which the default QuickBooks report doesn't have, but I think is worth having. Now, to the right of this data, we're not going to touch this data at all, but to the right of it, we're going to put some extra information. We're going to extract the budget code from the memo. We're going to put the budget line description, and then we're just going to repeat some of the information on the left, the amount, the account, the date, the reference, and the memo, and we're going to make a pivot table out of it. So let's see if we can get the budget code out of this memo here. So I'm going to use a formula called left. This is the text that I want to query, and I'm going to ask for the first 6 characters. So there we go, that was easy, 3.2, but that's actually 3.2 space. But on my donor report, I only want 3.2 with no spaces at the end. So I'm going to use another little formula here called trim, which just takes the spaces off the beginning and end of that. So now I've got just 3.2. Copy that down. Easy. So I also want to show what is the budget line description for 3.2. Is it relevant to fuel? Is it the right one? So here I'm going to do a lookup, VLOOKUP. I'm going to look up this code, and I'm going to look it up on the donor report, which is where I've got the codes and their descriptions in columns A and B. And I want to return the answer in the second column. There we go, that gives me that 3.2 has got the description domestic travel. So I'm going to copy that down. Oh, I forgot here, yes, we're going to pretend there was a mistake here. Let's pretend that's this. Okay. So you can see here that there's NA in here. That's because there's no budget code. So if it can't look up a budget code that isn't there, it brings an error. So I tend to put at the front of this, I put if error. If it's an error, then this is what it is without the error. This is what it would be with the error. I just put double quote marks, which is basically a blank text cell. So if I copy that down, instead of the NAs, I get blanks. But something is wrong with this one. It should have, it's got a budget code, but it doesn't seem to have a budget line description. So something's wrong. Let's have a look. It says 8.25 transport for this person to this place for assessment. 8.25. Let's have a look here. Down in the activities. Assessment should be 8.23. So that means that the thing in QuickBooks itself is wrong. So we're going to have to make a correction. And I'm going to colour this because we actually need to make the correction in QuickBooks itself. Now when we correct that, we get 8.23 and it says, oh, I recognise that. That's the assessment line. Now let's take a look at what would happen if this had been wrongly entered by the data entry person and they hadn't put the full 6 figures. Here you'd get 8.23 space T, and again you'd get a blank here, which would alert you that something was wrong. And later on when we check the totals, your totals wouldn't be right. The total per the report wouldn't equal the total per the pivot table. So we're going to put that back, correct that, as it was. Good. So the next thing we need is the amount. Well, there's the amount, so that's easy. But when we copy that down, we notice, oh, there's even amounts that don't relate to transactions. They're subtotals. I only want the amount if it's actually a transaction. We can see that every line that's a transaction has got something in column I. So I'm going to put in here an if formula. If there's something in column I, i.e. if the thing in column I is greater than 1, then give me that number. Otherwise, just give me a blank. I'm not actually going to put a $1 on that I because we're going to keep referring to that in other formulae. Now you'll see we've taken out the subtotals. It's not there anymore. We're going to do something similar for the account. The account is not in column K, the account is in column H. So it says if there's in something, if there's a transaction, if there's in something in column I, then give me the account which is in column H. Sorry, undo. Copy that down. I'll do something similar for the date. The date is in column E. Let's do E there. Oh, and it brings it in a nasty format, so we'll just put that date format there. The reference is in column F, so that works already, don't need to fix that. And the memo is in column G, so that works already, don't need to change that. So we can copy this all the way down to the bottom of the transactions. And you might have thousands of transactions, and using this method it would still be very simple to produce your report. Okay, so what we're going to do now is pivot this data. We're going to create a pivot table. That's really important that we don't have gaps in between these columns. If that was missing and it was blank, the pivot wouldn't work. Okay, so it has to be complete data. Also, if that was blank and it didn't have that formula in it, the pivot would just stop. Every single cell in this block, from here to here, right down to the bottom, has to have data in it for this to work. So put your cursor on L5, the top left of this pivot data with the column headings, and you're going to do insert pivot table. And we want the budget code in the row. I've just clicked and dragged that. And we want the amount in the values, clicked and dragged. Now the default is to give us a count, but we actually want a sum. So we go value field settings and we select the sum instead. Let's turn those into some prettier numbers. Let's see if that is the right total by comparing to our project listing, our transaction listing. Oh, there we are. Excellent, it's the same total. I'm going to rename this pivot. So what we have now is the exact same transactions, but they're organised by budget code, not by chart of accounts code. Now, if we come to our donor report, all we need to do is link it to, I'll take these out, these are from an earlier version, sorry, let's remove those. So I'm just going to link them. So all I'm doing here is typing equals, and then I'm selecting the row that's got 1.2.1 on the pivot table. So I'm just selecting this and clicking. Now, I haven't typed this complicated formula in here, it's just put it in by itself. When you click on one of the items in a pivot table, press enter, and it's brought that number. So can I copy that down? Probably not, because every single time it's looking for 1.2.1. So instead of 1.2.1, let's reference the budget line. And then when we copy down, it changes each time. Now, what's gone wrong with 1.2.2? Let's have a look on the pivot table. There are no transactions on 1.2.2. That means we didn't pay that person this month. It might be in the budget, so it's got a row on the report, but we didn't actually pay somebody. So here again, I use that if error formula, if error, and then if it is an error, I just want a 0. So now we can copy this down into every cell that needs a number. And there's my total. Is it the same as the total on the pivot? Yes, there we go. There's my donor report. Now, what about your donor comes along and says, but I want to know what's in district office supplies. So we could go back here to the transaction listing and say, well, it's every time we've got 5.04 in here. As you can see, it happens in two different accounts. We've got 5.04 for equipment repairs and maintenance. We've got it again here for stationery. It means district office supplies, so that makes sense. So, repair doesn't look like supplies, that looks like a coding error. Anyway, we'll leave that for now. Toner looks like supplies. Replacing the compressor, okay, for the frodge. So there's two transactions in here, but if you've got thousands of transactions, it's hard to know. But if you click on the pivot, if you click on here, it gives us a listing of exactly which transactions make up that total 750. So the auditor can see very nicely. It also shows the chart of accounts code. It's got the payment voucher reference, the date, and the amount. So you've got a complete audit trail for everything in here. The other place this is really useful is if on your budget you have to list individuals, but on your payroll you only have one account for payroll. You don't want to have a general ledger account for every individual, and yet your your donor report needs to have that. So that's how it works. I hope you like it. This has been Samantha Masoke, the singing accountant, with Humentum. Let me know if this works and if you use it.